At 11:58 p.m. on July 23, 1945, Commander Eugene Fluckey stood in the conning tower of USS Barb, less than 1,000 yards off the coast of Karafuto, watching 8 men paddle silently toward the Japanese mainland. 2 rubber boats cut through the black water. No lights, no radios, no second chances. Fluckey was 31 years old, already a legend. 5 war patrols as commanding officer. 17 enemy ships destroyed. The Japanese coast lay directly ahead. Territory no American combat unit had ever touched. Tonight would change that. Over the past month, more than 400 Japanese trains had moved along this coastal railway, hauling ammunition, fuel, and troops south in preparation for the coming Allied invasion. Fluckey had watched them night after night through his periscope. Long freight trains crawling along the shoreline, their silhouettes briefly visible against the surf before vanishing into darkness. Ships were becoming scarce. Trains were not. USS Barb had been on patrol for 45 days, one of the longest and most aggressive submarine missions of the war. During that time, Fluckey's crew had rewritten naval history, launching the first submarine-fired rockets ever used in combat, leveling factories at Sherry and Shikoku. They had shelled coastal installations with deck guns and sunk what little Japanese shipping still dared to move. But submarines were meant to fight from the sea. They hunted from below. They fired torpedoes from miles away. They vanished into the depths when hunted. They did not land men on enemy soil. Yet now, 8 unmarried sailors were rowing toward Japan itself, carrying a 55-pound demolition charge, 3 batteries, and a pressure-trigger detonator wired to explode beneath steel rails. Their target lay 1,500 feet inland. Their window was 90 minutes before dawn. Their escape plan consisted of one word: run. Fluckey lowered his binoculars and said nothing. 5 months earlier, he had received the Medal of Honor for leading Barb into Namquan Harbor off the Chinese coast. Waters so shallow the submarine scraped bottom. He had fired every torpedo aboard, destroyed or damaged 30 enemy ships, then escaped at 23.5 knots, setting a world speed record for submarines under combat conditions. After that patrol, the Navy gave him a choice. He could go home a hero, or he could take Barb out one last time. Fluckey chose the mission. His reasoning was brutally simple. American planners estimated the invasion of Japan would cost up to 1 million casualties. Every disrupted supply line meant fewer Japanese troops ready to fight. Every delay saved American lives. By July 1945, Japanese merchant shipping had collapsed. Convoys no longer sailed. Cargo ships hid in harbors. Destroyers stayed tied to piers, waiting for the invasion everyone knew was coming. Submarines were running out of targets. But the railways kept moving. The idea had come from Chief of the Boat Paul Saunders, a veteran of all 12 Barb patrols. He had spread a topographic map across the wardroom table and traced the railway with his finger, less than 2,000 feet from the shoreline, clearly visible from the submarine, lightly guarded, and reachable at night. Fluckey asked for volunteers. Every man knew what it meant. If they were captured, they would not be prisoners of war. They would be saboteurs, executed without trial. No rescue was possible. No extraction force existed. 8 men stepped forward. Now they were rowing toward Japan, while USS Barb waited offshore, engines silent, guns manned, crew holding their breath. In the final weeks of the Pacific War, the deadliest American submarine had just launched the only ground assault ever conducted by a U.S. submarine. And for the first time in history, American sailors were setting foot on the Japanese home islands. The rules for the landing party were simple. They had to be unmarried, and they had to be Boy Scouts. Commander Eugene Fluckey believed scouting mattered. Scouts knew navigation. They knew how to move quietly at night. They understood discipline under stress and how to improvise when plans broke down. This mission would allow no margin for error. Improvisation was already built into the weapon itself. The bomb wasn't designed for rail sabotage at all. It was a submarine scuttling charge, meant to destroy USS Barb if capture was imminent. Electrician's mate third-class Billy Hatfield had rewired it in the wardroom using spare parts and memory. The idea came from childhood. As a boy, Hatfield had placed walnuts on railroad tracks, watching trains crush them flat. Steel wheels didn't need much movement. Just enough pressure to finish the job. The physics were simple. The results would not be. Hatfield installed a micro-switch detonator beneath the rail. When a train passed overhead, the track would flex slightly. That flex would close the circuit. The charge would detonate directly beneath the steel, tearing the rail apart beneath a moving locomotive. No timer, no remote signal, nothing to give the device away. But the physics only worked if the men had time. Time to paddle ashore without being spotted by Japanese coastal patrols. Time to cross 1,500 feet of open terrain. Time to dig beneath the rails and bury the charge. Time to arm the micro-switch correctly. Time to run back to the boats. And time to row back to Barb before dawn exposed them on open water. Flucky checked his watch. 12:03 a.m. The rubber boats had vanished into the darkness. Below the surface, USS Barb waited at periscope depth, engines turning slowly, crew at battle stations. If Japanese patrol boats appeared, Flucky would dive instantly and try to circle back. If the landing party missed extraction, they had standing orders. Head north, toward Siberia, 130 miles through mountains and forest. Survive as long as possible. But Flucky had no intention of abandoning them. Across 5 war patrols, Barb had never lost a man. Not a single sailor had been killed by enemy action. No Purple Hearts. No graves at sea. Flucky intended to keep that record intact. On the beach, 8 Americans were already digging into Japanese soil. At 12:07 a.m., Lieutenant William Walker stepped onto the sand of the Japanese home islands. 24 years old. Naval Academy graduate. First war patrol. First time ashore in enemy territory. Behind him, 7 sailors dragged the rubber boats up the beach and into the treeline. No voices. No lights. Only controlled breathing and the soft scrape of wet gravel under boots. The beach was narrower than expected. Barely 30 feet of open sand before a dense wall of pine trees. Past the trees lay a drainage ditch. Beyond that, a coastal road. And beyond the road, 1,500 feet of open ground leading straight to the railway. Walker raised a hand. The men froze. Billy Hatfield shifted the weight of the canvas bag on his shoulder. Inside was 55 pounds of high explosive, the most dangerous object ever carried by Americans onto Japanese soil. They moved forward. The clock was already running. The device weighed 55 pounds. Explosives, 3 batteries, wiring, and a detonator, held together by ingenuity and necessity. At the heart of it all was the trigger mechanism, a micro-switch sealed inside a glass pickle jar. The design was brutally simple. When a train passed overhead, the steel rail would flex downward just enough to press against the jar. The pressure would compress the switch. The circuit would close. Current would flow from the batteries to the detonator. The charge would explode directly beneath the track. Hatfield had tested it 3 times aboard USS Barb. 3 successful detonations. But shipboard tests weren't combat. Rain could short the wiring. Ground vibrations could trigger it too early. A Japanese patrol could discover them before the switch was armed. Nothing about this was forgiving. The landing party moved inland in single file, boots sinking softly into damp earth. Lieutenant Walker led. Hatfield followed, the canvas bag heavy on his shoulder. 6 sailors trailed behind, spread out, carrying shovels and wire cutters. For 2 weeks, they had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs. The railway ran roughly 2,000 feet inland, parallel to the coast. A dirt service road connected it to the coastal highway. Japanese maintenance crews used that road every morning at dawn. Walker checked his watch. 90 minutes. Time had become the enemy now. Not soldiers, not patrol boats, just the slow rotation of the earth toward daylight. They reached the drainage ditch at 12:15 a.m. It was deeper than the photographs suggested. 6 feet down. 2 feet of standing water. Walker climbed in first. Cold water flooded his boots instantly. He crossed in 4 steps, pulled himself up the far bank, and scanned the coastal road. Empty. No headlights. No sentries. No movement. Half a mile south, faint yellow lights marked a fishing village, but here the road was silent and black. The rest of the men crossed in pairs. When all 8 were over, Walker raised his hand and pointed forward. Beyond the road lay the most dangerous stretch of the mission. 1,500 feet of open ground. No trees. No buildings. No cover. Just tall grass, uneven earth, scattered rocks, and moonlight. If a Japanese patrol appeared, there would be nowhere to hide. Walker made the call. They would not cross together. Too slow. Too visible. Instead, they split. Team 1 would cross first and secure the tracks. Team 2 would wait at the tree-line with Hatfield and the bomb. 3 sailors broke cover and sprinted. Walker watched their dark shapes melt into the distance. He counted silently. 30 seconds. 45. 60. No shots. No shouts. No alarms. Team 1 had made it. Walker turned and tapped Hatfield on the shoulder. They ran. The ground was worse than it looked. Hidden divots, loose stones, uneven grass. Hatfield stumbled twice, but stayed upright. The canvas bag slammed against his hip with every stride. Walker fixed his eyes on the darkness ahead. Just keep moving. Just reach the rails. They covered the 1,500 feet in 2 minutes. Breathing hard, legs burning, they reached the shadow of the railway embankment. Now the real work would begin, and the clock was still running. The railway was a single track line, running north to south along the coast. Steel rails rested on wooden ties embedded in coarse gravel. Along the eastern side stood a line of telegraph poles, their wires stretching inland. Communication lines linking coastal stations to rear area command posts. Walker dropped to one knee beside the track. Hatfield set the canvas bag down and opened it. The other sailors fanned out into a loose perimeter, eyes scanning north and south along the rails. No headlights. No silhouettes. No sound of engines or footsteps. The line was empty. Hatfield pulled out a shovel and began digging between 2 ties. The gravel shifted easily, scraped aside in quick, practiced motions. He carved out a cavity roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, large enough for the charge, deep enough to conceal the wiring. Another sailor joined him. 2 shovels moved in rhythm. Gravel flew. Breath fogged the cold night air. Sweat ran despite the chill. Walker checked his watch. 12:28, 12:31, 12:34, 56 minutes until dawn. Hatfield lowered the bomb into the hole, easing it down carefully. The detonator had to remain upright. He adjusted it by hand, then routed the wiring upward through the gravel toward the micro switch. The switch itself had one job. It needed to sit directly beneath the rail. When a train passed overhead, the weight would press the steel down just enough to compress the switch, close the circuit, and fire the detonator. Simple in theory, unforgiving in execution. Hatfield placed the micro switch beneath the southern rail and tested its position. Once, then again. Too much space, and the train would roll over harmlessly. Too little, and vibrations from an approaching locomotive could trigger it early, while the landing party was still nearby. He made his final adjustment at 12:41 a.m. The device was armed. Now all it needed was a train. Walker gave the signal. At 12:43, the team began erasing themselves. They smoothed the disturbed gravel with bare hands, scattered loose stones to break up patterns, brushed away footprints near the ties. The goal was invisibility. A Japanese maintenance crew at dawn should see nothing. No displaced earth, no exposed wire, no evidence that 8 Americans had been there minutes earlier. Hatfield made one last inspection. The micro switch sat snug against the underside of the rail. The wiring disappeared cleanly into the gravel. The bomb waited, silent and hidden. Everything was set. At 12:47, they turned back toward the beach. The return felt longer. The adrenaline that had powered the sprint inland was gone, replaced by fatigue and unease. Every shadow suggested movement. Every sound felt amplified. Walker kept them moving. They crossed the 1,500 feet of open ground in 3 minutes. No shots. No alarms. They slipped back into the tree line unseen. Behind them, beneath an untouched stretch of railway, the device waited. They crossed the coastal road again in pairs. Each movement was deliberate. One man watched north, another south. Then they moved. Still no patrols. Still no vehicles. Still no indication they had been seen. But the night was thinning. The eastern horizon was beginning to pale, not sunrise yet, just a faint gray pressing into the black. Dawn was coming. They had maybe 40 minutes before the coast belonged to daylight. The landing party reached the drainage ditch at 12:56 a.m. One man at a time, they climbed down, waded through cold, waist-deep water, and pulled themselves up the far bank. Mud clung to their boots. Breath came harder now, not from exertion but from urgency. They slipped back into the pine trees and moved toward the beach. Walker caught his first glimpse of the ocean through the trunks. dark water reflecting moonlight. Somewhere out there, 950 yards offshore, USS Barb waited at periscope depth, engines turning quietly, ready to dive. They reached the beach at 1:03 a.m. The two rubber boats were exactly where they had left them, hidden in the tree-line. The sailors dragged them down to the water's edge. Walker scanned the shoreline in both directions. Empty. No fishermen. No patrol boats. No searchlights. They pushed the boats into the surf at 1:05. 4 men per boat. Paddles dipped into the black water, pulling hard against the incoming tide. The boats struggled at first, hulls lifting and dropping in the surf. Then they cleared the break, and the paddling became smoother, steady, controlled. Walker looked back once. The beach was already dissolving into darkness. In a few hours, Japanese civilians in the fishing village would wake, light their stoves, and begin the day. They would never know that 8 Americans had crossed their shore in the night. The boats reached Barb at 1:18 a.m. Hands reached down from the deck, hauling the men aboard. The rubber boats were deflated and stowed. The landing party dropped through the forward hatch into the submarine. Commander Flucky was waiting in the control room. He checked his watch. 1:21 a.m. The team had been ashore for 71 minutes, ahead of schedule. No injuries. No enemy contact. The mission had unfolded exactly as planned. Except for one thing. The bomb had not detonated. Flucky ordered Barb to remain at periscope depth. They would wait offshore and listen. If a train triggered the device, the explosion would carry over water from more than 2,000 yards away. If no train came, they would surface at dawn and abort. The waiting began. 1:30 a.m. No explosion. 1:45 a.m. Nothing. 2 a.m. Silence. The control room was still, broken only by the low hum of electric motors and the occasional ping of sonar. Every man aboard understood what was happening. 8 sailors had buried a bomb beneath a Japanese railway. Now the war paused, holding its breath, waiting to see if a train would come. Flucky remained at the periscope, watching the coast. The fishing village lights were still visible, small, steady points along the shoreline. Beyond them ran the dark, unbroken line of the railway, parallel to the beach. He could see the track clearly in the gray pre-dawn light. What he could not see was the bomb. He could not see the microswitch. He could not know whether the wiring was intact, whether moisture had seeped into the circuit, whether something had shifted beneath the rail. Submarine warfare was built on patience. Long stretches of waiting, broken by moments of violence. Flucky had learned that across 5 war patrols, how to trust his crew, trust his equipment, trust a plan once it was set in motion. But this was different. Tonight, Barb was not hunting. She was waiting. Waiting for a train. Waiting for a Japanese locomotive engineer to follow his timetable. Waiting for 55 pounds of explosives to do exactly what they had been built to do. 2:15 a.m. The eastern sky was noticeably lighter now. Still dark, but thinning. Maybe 20 minutes until dawn. 2:25 a.m. No train. 2:32 a.m. Flucky was about to give the order to withdraw when the sonar operator spoke. Surface contact. Moving south along the coast. Speed approximately 30 miles per hour. It wasn't a ship. Radar confirmed it. The contact was on land, moving steadily along the railway toward the target point. A train. Flucky leaned into the periscope. The silhouette emerged against the brightening sky. A single locomotive pulling freight cars south along the coastal line. Black smoke trailed from the stack. The headlamp cut a narrow cone through the darkness. Speed steady. Roughly 30 miles per hour. Standard for this route. 2:37 a.m. 4 miles north. 2:40 a.m. 3 miles. 2:42 a.m. 2 miles. The control room was silent now, except for the low hum of motors and the steady rhythm of sonar. No one spoke. Every man aboard was thinking the same thing. Would the microswitch work? Would the rail flex enough to close the circuit? Would the bomb detonate, or sit buried, useless, beneath Japanese steel? Flucky kept his eye pressed to the periscope. The locomotive was clearly visible now. Freight cars followed behind it in a long, dark chain. No sign of braking. No indication the crew suspected anything wrong. 2:45 a.m. 1 mile. The sonar operator counted down softly. Half a mile. Quarter mile. The train was entering the exact section of track where Hatfield had buried the device. Flucky held his breath. At 2:47 a.m., the eastern sky turned white. The explosion lit the coastline like a magnesium flare. A column of fire erupted from the railway, climbing nearly 200 feet into the air. The locomotive's boiler detonated, releasing superheated steam, burning coal, and twisted steel in every direction. The blast was so intense that Flucky jerked back from the periscope, momentarily blinded. The bomb had worked. When Flucky leaned back into the periscope, debris was still falling. The locomotive no longer existed as a coherent machine. The front half had been annihilated, vaporized by the combined force of the buried charge and the catastrophic boiler explosion. What remained of the engine surged forward under its own momentum, slamming into the wreckage ahead. The freight cars followed with mechanical inevitability. The first car rammed into the destroyed locomotive and collapsed inward, its steel frame folding like paper. The second climbed over it, tipped, and rolled off the track. The third struck the second and flipped completely onto its side. Cars 4 through 8 plowed into the growing mass of twisted metal. Cars 9 through 16 derailed in sequence, each adding weight and violence to the pileup. The entire train disintegrated in less than 10 seconds. A thick column of smoke rose above the wreckage, black oil smoke mixing with white steam. Flames spread rapidly as cargo ignited. Steel fragments arced through the air and crashed back to Earth across a radius of nearly 200 feet. Sections of wheel assemblies, torn boiler plates, lengths of rail hurled from their beds. Flucky watched as the smoke expanded and fires multiplied along the track. The train had been carrying ammunition. Secondary detonations rippled through the wreckage as shells cooked off in the heat. The sound reached Barb 8 seconds after the flash, a deep, rolling concussion that reverberated through the submarine's hull, followed by a series of sharp cracks as more rounds detonated. The shock wave passed through the water. Not enough to damage the boat. More than enough to confirm success. Billy Hatfield's microswitch had worked exactly as designed. 55 pounds of explosives had destroyed a 16-car Japanese supply train. The locomotive was scrap. The freight cars were kindling. The railway itself lay buried beneath tons of wreckage. Clearing the line would take weeks. And it had been done with a pickle jar, 3 batteries, and 8 men who were already back at sea. Flucky kept watching. Lights flickered on in the fishing village to the south. Civilians emerged from their homes, pointing toward the flames and smoke rising along the coast. Before long, emergency crews would arrive, fire brigades, military police, railway officials. They would count the wreckage. They would tally the dead. They would search for answers. They would not find the bomb. The explosion had erased it completely. The microswitch was gone. The wiring scattered among twisted steel. The pickle jar reduced to shards buried in gravel. All that remained was a crater beneath the rails and a destroyed train. The official conclusion would be simple. Boiler failure. Mechanical fault. Poor maintenance. Bad coal. Anything except the truth. That 8 American sailors had walked onto Japanese soil, destroyed a strategic railway, and walked away. Flucky stepped back from the periscope and turned to his executive officer. Time to leave. Japanese patrol boats would soon be sortying from the naval base at WWII. Search aircraft would begin flying at first light. Barb had to be gone before either arrived. But before withdrawal, Flucky addressed one final matter. Every man who had taken part in the landing would be formally recognized. Flucky intended to see to that himself. Letters of commendation, service medals, full documentation of the operation. What 8 sailors had accomplished on the Japanese home islands could not be allowed to fade into rumor or footnote. The Navy needed to understand what had just happened. Future submarine commanders would need to study this mission. Future landing parties would need to learn from it. Because this was not simply the destruction of a train. It was proof of concept. Submarines were no longer limited to torpedoes and periscopes. They could launch rockets against shore targets. They could place men ashore. They could strike infrastructure deep inland, railways, factories, communications lines, in ways the Navy had never formally considered possible. Barb had expanded the boundaries of submarine warfare. Flucky gave the order to dive. The periscope retracted. The bow dipped. Within 90 seconds, the submarine slipped beneath the surface and turned east toward deeper water. Behind them, the wrecked train continued to burn, flames licking at twisted steel as secondary explosions echoed along the track. For the next 3 days, Barb patrolled east of Carafuto. Flucky kept the boat submerged during daylight hours, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and monitor radio traffic. Japanese search aircraft were active. Patrol boats swept the coastline, but they were hunting saboteurs, not submarines. Japanese radio traffic confirmed it. The explosion had been classified as a catastrophic boiler failure. Railway officials blamed poor maintenance. Army officers argued over coal quality. No one mentioned bombs. No one mentioned landing parties. No one suspected an American submarine had been involved. The mission had succeeded beyond expectations. On July 26th, Flucky ordered the patrol terminated. Barb had been at sea for 48 days. Fuel reserves were running low. Food supplies were sufficient but dwindling. The crew was exhausted, and every operational objective had been met. Rocket attacks on Sherry, Shikuka, and Kashiho had destroyed multiple industrial targets. Shore bombardments had eliminated coastal installations. The railway explosion had halted traffic along the Kafuto line for weeks. Barb had demonstrated that submarines could strike land targets decisively, without torpedoes. Flucky set course for Midway. The transit took 6 days. The submarine traveled submerged by day and surfaced only at night, standard procedure in contested waters. Japanese patrol aircraft remained active until Barb crossed into international waters east of the Kuril Islands. On August 2, 1945, Barb surfaced 5 miles east of Midway and signaled the harbor control tower. Permission to enter port was granted immediately. The submarine entered the lagoon at 10 knots, following the harbor pilot's instructions. The entire crew was topside as Barb approached the pier. They had spent most of the previous week submerged. Fresh air and sunlight felt unfamiliar after weeks inside the confined steel hull of a fleet submarine. Flucky stood on the bridge watching the dock draw closer. A small crowd had gathered, officers from Submarine Squadron 50, base administrative staff, and several photographers with press cameras. Word of the train explosion had traveled quickly. Barb secured to Pier 7 at 1,430 hours. Gangplanks were run out. The crew disembarked in groups as shore patrol personnel checked identification and directed sailors toward processing areas. The 8 men who had gone ashore were immediately separated from the rest of the crew. They were escorted to a secured conference room where intelligence officers were already waiting. This was standard procedure. The debriefing would be extensive. Every phase of the operation would be recorded. Planning, execution, risks, timing, equipment, contingencies. The Navy needed to know whether the mission had succeeded by circumstance or by method, and whether it could be repeated. Flucky spent 4 hours in his own debriefing. He walked the intelligence officers through the entire operation from inception to withdrawal. Volunteer selection criteria. The requirement that the men be unmarried. The preference for Boy Scouts. The decision to use a scuttling charge. The improvised microswitch trigger. The choice of landing site. Timing windows. Extraction contingencies. The officers asked detailed questions. How close had Japanese patrols come to detecting the landing party? What was the exact terrain between the beach and the railway? How long did it take to arm the device? How visible was the submarine from shore at 950 yards? Flucky answered each question directly. He described coastal defenses. He outlined the fishing village layout. He estimated Japanese response times following the explosion. He offered recommendations for improving future operations, including alternate trigger mechanisms and extraction signaling procedures. The debriefers showed particular interest in the microswitch design. Billy Hatfield was brought into the room. He explained the device in detail, drawing wiring diagrams by hand. He described how the pickle jar housed the switch, how rail deflection under train weight compressed the glass, how the circuit closed, how current flowed from the batteries to the detonator. The Navy wanted to know whether other submarine crews could replicate the device. Hatfield confirmed they could. Scuttling charges were standard equipment aboard submarines. Batteries were readily available. Microswitches could be obtained through supply channels. The only real requirement was an electrician capable of wiring the circuit correctly. The debriefing concluded at 1845 hours. Flucky and the landing party were released with instructions to report again the following morning. They stepped out of the building into the warm Midway evening. A crowd had gathered outside. Sailors from other boats, support personnel, base staff, Word had spread. These were the men who had destroyed a train on the Japanese home islands. The landing party did not linger. They were exhausted. Most had been awake for more than 20 hours. They had paddled 2 miles in rubber boats. They had planted a bomb beneath a Japanese railway. They had witnessed the largest explosion any of them had ever seen. And they had spent 4 hours answering questions in a windowless conference room. They were exhausted. But they also understood that something significant had occurred. They had done something no submarine crew had ever done before. They had landed on enemy territory. They had completed their mission. They had returned without casualties. And they had demonstrated that submarines could operate far beyond their traditional role as torpedo platforms. The Barb's battle flag would soon reflect that achievement. At the bottom center of the flag, between the symbols for ships sunk and rocket attacks conducted, the crew added a new image: a locomotive. It would remain the only train ever destroyed by a submarine in naval history. The awards ceremony took place 6 weeks later at Pearl Harbor. By then, the war was over. Japan had surrendered on August 15th following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Pacific Fleet was beginning to demobilize. Thousands of sailors were preparing to return home. But the Navy still had unfinished business. On September 18, 1945, Commander Eugene Fluckey received his 4th Navy Cross. The citation specifically referenced the Barb's 12th War Patrol, its rocket attacks, shore bombardments, and the demolition of the Japanese train. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor. Only the Medal of Honor ranked higher. Fluckey already held that distinction. He had received the Medal of Honor in March 1945 for the Barb's 11th War Patrol, conducted from December 19, 1944 through February 15, 1945. That patrol had taken place in the Formosa Strait and the East China Sea. Its mission was to disrupt Japanese shipping along the Chinese coast. On January 8, 1945, Barb encountered Convoy 30, 9 cargo ships escorted by multiple warships. Fluckey attacked at night on the surface. One large ammunition ship was sunk. The resulting explosion illuminated the entire convoy. Japanese escorts responded immediately with gunfire and depth charges. Barb escaped by running on the surface at high speed. Then came Namquan Harbor. On January 25, 1945, Fluckey discovered more than 30 Japanese ships anchored inside the harbor. The harbor lay along the Chinese coast, roughly 26 miles inside the 20-fathom curve. Standard submarine doctrine warned against entering such waters. Deep water provided maneuvering room and escape routes. Shallow water offered neither. Namquan Harbor had only 5 fathoms, approximately 30 feet of depth, barely enough for Barb to operate submerged. The bottom was uncharted. Rocks and reefs could tear open the hull. Mines could be present. Once inside, the only exit was back through the same narrow channel. Fluckey decided to attack anyway. After midnight, Barb slipped into the harbor. Fluckey navigated by periscope alone, eyes alternating between the dark shoreline and the depth gauge. Every foot mattered. The submarine moved at 5 knots, slow enough to avoid leaving a visible wake, fast enough to maintain precise steering control. At a range of 3,000 yards, Fluckey ordered the firing of Barb's remaining forward torpedoes. 8 fish. 8 targets. The torpedoes ran hot and straight. 6 found their mark. 3 ships detonated immediately. 1 was an ammunition ship. Its explosion was catastrophic. Burning debris arced across the harbor. Shells cooked off midair, bursting like flares above the anchored vessels. Fire spread rapidly. Secondary explosions followed as fuel and cargo ignited. Japanese escorts reacted, but confusion ruled the harbor. No one could determine the submarine's position. Fluckey brought Barb hard about and ordered the stern tubes fired. 4 more torpedoes left the boat. 2 more ships were hit. By the time Japanese destroyers began organized search patterns, Barb was already accelerating toward the harbor entrance. The escape took 1 hour. 1 hour at full speed through uncharted, rock-strewn water. Barb ran on the surface. Engines pushed beyond rated capacity, 150% power. Speed climbed to 23.5 knots, setting a world record for submarines at the time. Japanese destroyers gave chase, but could not close the distance. Shore batteries opened fire, but Barb's speed and erratic course defeated accurate targeting. At dawn, the submarine reached open water. Behind them, Namquan Harbor burned. 8 ships had been struck. 6 were sinking or already lost. Japanese repair crews would spend weeks clearing the wreckage. For that action, Fluckey was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. President Harry Truman presented the medal at the White House in March 1945. Fluckey accepted it on behalf of his entire crew. The Medal of Honor did not end his career as a submarine commander. The Navy offered him a choice: accept a desk assignment or take Barb on one final patrol. Fluckey chose the patrol. His reasoning had not changed. The war was still being fought. American lives were still at risk. Submarines could still make a difference. And Barb was ready. That decision led directly to the 12th War Patrol, the rocket attacks, the shore bombardments, and the demolition of the Japanese train. The only American ground combat operation conducted on the Japanese home islands during the war. Now, in September 1945, Fluckey stood at attention as Admiral Chester Nimitz pinned a 4th Navy Cross to his uniform. The ceremony was brief. No speeches, no press photographers, just a formal presentation before assembled naval officers at Pearl Harbor. Afterward, Nimitz asked him about his plans. The war was over. The submarine fleet was shrinking. Many commanders would be reassigned or released from active duty. Fluckey said he intended to remain in the Navy. Submarine warfare, he explained, had changed during the war, and it would continue to change. Someone would need to shape what came next. Torpedoes were no longer the only weapon. Submarines could carry rockets. They could send landing parties ashore. They could operate in shallow coastal waters once considered too dangerous for submerged vessels. The future of submarine warfare was only beginning. Nimitz agreed. The Navy would need experienced commanders to develop new tactics, train new crews, and test the limits of what submarines could do. Fluckey would be one of those men. Eugene Fluckey remained in the United States Navy for 27 more years after the war ended. From 1947 to 1949, he commanded the submarine USS Halfbeak. In 1949, he established the Submarine Naval Reserve Force. He served as Flag Secretary to Admiral James Fife Jr. in 1950. He assumed command of Submarine Division 12. He later commanded the submarine tender USS Sperry and Submarine Squadron 5. In 1960, Fluckey was promoted to Rear Admiral. He went on to serve as commander of Amphibious Group 4 and later as president of the Board of Inspection and Survey. From 1966 to 1968, he served as director of naval intelligence. His final assignment was chief of the Military Advisory Group to Portugal, where he served from 1969 until his retirement in August 1972. 37 years of active service. 5 war patrols as a submarine commander. 1 Medal of Honor. 4 Navy Crosses. 2 Silver Stars. The Legion of Merit. The Bronze Star. Presidential Unit Citations. Navy Unit Commendations. A record that would stand for decades. USS Barb was officially credited with sinking 17 enemy vessels totaling 96,628 tons during World War II. That total included the Japanese aircraft carrier Yunyo, sunk on September 17, 1944. Barb ranked 4th among all American submarines in total tonnage destroyed, surpassed only by USS Flasher, USS Rasher, and USS Tang. But Barb's legacy went beyond numbers. The submarine pioneered tactics that reshaped naval thinking: night surface attacks, shallow water harbor raids, rocket bombardment of shore targets, and commando operations on enemy territory. Each had once been considered too risky. Fluckey demonstrated they were not only possible, but effective. Other submarine commanders followed. By late 1945, multiple submarines were being fitted with rocket launchers. Plans were underway for additional landing operations along the Japanese coast. The atomic bomb ended the war before those plans could be carried out, but the foundation had already been laid. During the Cold War, submarines evolved further: nuclear propulsion, ballistic missiles, guided cruise missiles. Each development built on lessons learned during the war. Submarines were no longer just torpedo platforms. They had become strategic weapons capable of projecting power far inland. The 8 sailors who carried out the landing party operation returned quietly to civilian life. Most never spoke publicly about what they had done. The mission remained classified for years. By the time it was declassified, the men had families, careers, responsibilities that had nothing to do with rubber boats and buried explosives. Billy Hatfield, the electrician who designed the micro-switch detonator, returned to his home state and worked as an electrical contractor for 4 decades. He rarely discussed his Navy service. When asked, he would simply say he had served on submarines. Nothing more. The train destroyed off Cafuto remains the only train ever demolished by a submarine crew in naval history. No marker stands on the railway. No plaque marks the beach. The pickle jar, the wiring, the bomb, all were reduced to fragments beneath twisted steel. But for one night in July 1945, 8 Americans walked onto the Japanese home islands, struck at the heart of an Empire's supply line, and vanished back into the sea. And no one on shore ever knew they had been there. The train explosion was only one night among many spent at sea. Paul Saunders, the chief of the boat who had first suggested the railway operation, remained in the Navy for another decade. He served aboard multiple submarines through the late 1940s and early 1950s and retired in 1955 as a chief petty officer. His service record listed dozens of war patrols and hundreds of days submerged, but Barb remained the assignment he remembered most clearly. Lieutenant William Walker, who had led the landing party ashore, left the Navy in 1946. He attended law school under the GI Bill and practiced law in California for the next 30 years. He occasionally attended submarine reunions, where veterans gathered to remember patrols and lost friends, but he rarely spoke about the night he and 7 other men crossed a Japanese beach and buried a bomb beneath a railway. The submarine USS Barb outlived many expectations. After the war, she was decommissioned and placed in reserve. In 1954, she was transferred to the Italian Navy under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program and renamed Enrico Tazzoli. She served Italy for 18 years before being sold for scrap in 1972 for approximately $100,000. Admiral Fluckey later remarked that had the crew known the submarine would be scrapped, they would have purchased her themselves and returned her to the United States as a museum ship. The Barb's battle flag survived. It is now displayed at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut. The flag bears the symbols of 17 ships sunk, multiple rocket attacks, shore bombardments, and at the bottom center, a single locomotive. Visitors who see the flag often pause at that symbol. In 2020, the Secretary of the Navy announced that a future Virginia-class submarine would carry the name USS Barb. Designated SSN 804, the new submarine will inherit the legacy of the original, 12 war patrols in the Pacific and a record of innovation that reshaped submarine warfare. But the most remarkable statistic associated with USS Barb had nothing to do with tonnage sunk or weapons employed. In 5 war patrols under Eugene Fluckey's command, the submarine suffered 0 casualties. Not one sailor killed. Not one man lost ashore. Not one life sacrificed to achieve results. That, more than any locomotive symbol or decoration, was the measure of the crew and of the commander who brought every man home. Not one man wounded in combat. Not one man lost to enemy action. Not a single Purple Heart awarded to any crew member during Eugene Fluckey's command. This was not luck. It was leadership. Fluckey believed that aggressive action saved lives. Submarines that waited passively for targets invited danger. Submarines that struck decisively and withdrew quickly survived. Barb proved that theory across 5 war patrols and 48 combat actions. The crew trusted Fluckey because his decisions were calculated, not reckless. He studied intelligence reports carefully. He analyzed enemy patrol patterns. He identified escape routes before launching attacks, not after. And he never asked his men to take risks he would not take himself. That trust created an environment where innovation flourished. Billy Hatfield felt confident enough to suggest a micro-switch detonator based on childhood experience. Paul Saunders felt empowered to propose landing parties on enemy beaches. Sailors volunteered for dangerous missions because they believed their commander would bring them home. And he did, every single time. The legacy of USS Barb extends beyond ships sunk or a single train destroyed. The submarine demonstrated what small crews could accomplish when properly led and properly motivated. The 8 men who landed at Carafuto were not elite commandos. They were ordinary sailors, electricians, torpedo men, engine room personnel, who volunteered because they believed their actions mattered. That spirit defined the American submarine force during World War II. More than 50 U.S. submarines were lost during the war. Over 3,500 submariners died in combat. The casualty rate among submarine crews was the highest of any branch of the American military. Roughly 22% of those who went to sea never returned. Yet those who did return had altered the course of the war. American submarines sank more than 1,200 Japanese merchant ships. They destroyed nearly 30% of Japan's navy. They severed supply lines across the Pacific and forced Japan to divert destroyers and aircraft from offensive operations to anti-submarine patrols. Barb's contribution to that effort was significant, but not unique. Dozens of submarines conducted equally dangerous patrols. Hundreds of commanders made equally bold decisions. Thousands of submariners served with the same discipline and resolve. What made Barb unforgettable was the train. That single operation captured the imagination of the Navy and the public alike. A submarine that landed men ashore and destroyed a locomotive became a symbol of American ingenuity. The story was retold in newspapers, incorporated into Navy training materials, and passed down as submarine service legend. Eugene Fluckey understood the power of that symbol, and he made certain the men who carried it out received the recognition they deserved. He documented every detail of the operation for future commanders to study. He advocated new tactics and new equipment that would allow submarines to operate more aggressively and more flexibly. And he spent the remainder of his career pushing the boundaries of what submarines could accomplish. Eugene Fluckey died on June 28, 2007, at the age of 93. He was buried at the United States Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis, Maryland. His gravestone lists his rank, his years of service, and his decorations. It does not mention the train. It does not need to. Everyone who served in submarines knows the story. USS Barb's 12th war patrol lasted 55 days. The submarine traveled more than 10,000 miles. The crew fired 72 rockets at Japanese shore targets. They sank patrol boats and cargo vessels. They bombarded coastal installations. And they sent 8 men ashore to plant a bomb beneath a railway line. That bomb detonated at 2:47 a.m. on July 23, 1945. The explosion destroyed 16 railroad cars and killed an estimated 150 Japanese soldiers and railway workers. The track damage disrupted Japanese supply operations for more than 3 weeks. The psychological impact lasted far longer. Japan surrendered 3 weeks later. The atomic bombs were the immediate cause. But the cumulative effect of 3 years of submarine warfare had already crippled Japan's ability to continue fighting. Ships could no longer move supplies. Factories could not obtain raw materials. Troops could not be reinforced or resupplied. The submarine blockade had slowly strangled the Japanese war effort. USS Barb was only one part of that campaign. But on one night in July 1945, 8 sailors proved that submarines were no longer confined to the sea. They could strike railways. They could land men on enemy soil. They could rewrite the rules of naval warfare. And they could do it without losing a single man.